You're embarrassing me, Dad. Honestly, I'm ashamed to even call you my father. Those were the words my son, Jacob, spat at me in front of his wife, her parents, and half a table of strangers at the Rusty Fork Diner in Moline, Illinois. His face was red, his jaw tight, his voice loud enough that the couple in the booth behind us turned to stare. I just sat there, my hand frozen halfway to my coffee mug, while the words echoed in my head. Ashamed. My son said he was ashamed of me. I should have been used to the little digs by now. The comments about my old pickup, my steel-toe work boots, my outdated flip phone. But this was different. He said it with venom. And in public. Before I continue, if you're new here, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell us where you're watching from. I'm not a complicated man. My name's Robert Hayes. I'm 63 years old, born and raised in Rock Island, right across the Mississippi. I worked 38 years at John Deere, long shifts and plenty of overtime, until my back finally gave out, and the doctor said no more factory floors for me. I raised my son, Jacob, mostly alone after my wife passed when he was 13. Baseball games, college tuition, first car. I made sure he had it all, even when it meant I went without. And now, he sat there in his pressed shirt and shiny watch, acting like I was dirt on his shoes. Jacob's wife, Allison, smirked into her mimosa. Her parents shifted uncomfortably, though not enough to defend me. I set my mug down, my hand steady now. "Is that so, Jacob?" I asked quietly. He leaned back in his seat, puffing out his chest. "Yeah, it is. You walk around like some small-town has-been. You show up in those work clothes, talking like you haven't seen the world. You make me look bad." The sting wasn't just in the words. It was in the fact that he meant them. I thought about all the nights I worked double shifts so he could get braces, all the weekends I drove him to debate tournaments across the Midwest, all the years I lived in a house with a leaky roof so he could go to a private college. And now he was ashamed. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around that diner, the smell of bacon grease, the sound of dishes clattering, the light coming through the smudged windows. It was the kind of place I'd spent half my life in, grabbing breakfast before heading to the plant. It was real, honest, unlike the man my son had become. I knew in that moment something had shifted. I wasn't just hurt. I was done being treated like a burden, like a stain on his perfect image. And I had a feeling that before this was over, Jacob was going to learn what real shame felt like. I didn't say another word that morning. I paid my half of the check, cash, the way I always do, and walked out of the Rusty Fork without looking back. The cold February air hit me in the chest, sharp and biting, but it wasn't the wind that made it hard to breathe. It was the fact that my own son had just humiliated me like I was nothing. For the rest of that day, I kept replaying his words in my head. Ashamed, embarrassed, has been. Words you don't expect to hear from your own flesh and blood. I'd worked my hands raw to give Jacob a life better than mine, and this was my repayment. That night, I sat in my recliner with the old Packers blanket draped over my legs, staring at the muted TV. I thought about my wife, Margaret. If she were still alive, she wouldn't have let Jacob get away with speaking to me like that. She would have set him straight, but she wasn't here. It was just me, and the ache of betrayal sat heavier than the arthritis in my knees. A few days later, I stopped by Jacob's house in Davenport to drop off a box of tools he'd borrowed months ago. His house sat on a tidy cul-de-sac. Fresh vinyl siding, manicured lawn, shiny SUV in the driveway. When he opened the door, he looked annoyed, like I was a salesman interrupting his evening. "Dad, you can't just show up here unannounced," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I was just returning your socket set," I told him. Holding up the box, he sighed and motioned me inside. Allison was in the kitchen, pouring wine into tall glasses. "Oh, it's Robert," she said, her tone flat. We were just about to eat, her parents. The Whitmans were seated at the dining table, dressed like they were heading to the country club. Mr. Whitman gave me a tight smile. Mrs. Whitman didn't even look up from her phone. I set the tools on the counter. "Didn't mean to intrude," I said. Allison raised an eyebrow. "Well, since you're here, maybe you can explain to Jacob why it's not a good look for him to show up at corporate events with." "Well, with someone who doesn't exactly fit in." Her words were sweetened with that fake politeness she wore like perfume, but the message stung all the same. Jacob leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "She's right, Dad. You don't understand the circles I move in now. Showing up in boots and plaid shirts, people notice." I stared at him, trying to keep my voice calm. "So what you're saying is, I embarrass you in front of your bosses." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence in that room said enough. I left without touching their food, their wine, their perfect little life. Driving back across the I-74 bridge, the Mississippi dark and wide beneath me, I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My son wasn't just ashamed of me. He was trying to erase me. And I'll tell you this much. You can call me old. You can call me simple. But you don't erase a man who sacrificed everything for you. Not without consequences. And as I crossed that river, a plan started to take shape in my mind. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a pot of black coffee and my old leather binder full of papers. I hadn't looked through it in years, but I knew exactly what was inside. Deeds, titles, bank receipts, the kind of documents you don't think about much until life forces you to. See, back in the late 90s, when Jacob was just starting high school, I bought a plot of land on the edge of town. Nothing special, just a stretch of Iowa farmland with a rundown barn and some timber behind it. Folks thought I was crazy, paying cash for property when the dot-com bubble was booming. But I'd been raised to believe land was the one thing they weren't making any more of. Turns out, I was right. 20 years later, that nothing special farmland had tripled in value. Developers had been sniffing around for years, wanting to build subdivisions, strip malls, you name it. But I held on to it, thinking maybe one day Jacob could use it. As I flipped through the documents, I stopped at the warranty deed with my name printed clean across the bottom. Robert H. Miller. My pen strokes, strong and certain. That land was mine, still mine. And Jacob didn't even know it. The next week, I drove down to the courthouse in Rock Island, climbed those worn marble steps, and requested updated copies of every record tied to that property. The clerk, a kind woman named Evelyn who'd known me for years, gave me a curious look. "Thinking of selling, Bob?" she asked. "Not yet," I said with a small smile. "Just making sure my ducks are in a row." On my way out, I ran into an old buddy, Frank, who used to swing a hammer with me back in my contracting days. We got to talking, and when I mentioned the Whitmans, he shook his head. "Bob, I've heard things about that family. They don't just want your boy's future. They want control. You be careful." That stuck with me. 2 days later, I stopped by Jacob's office to surprise him with lunch. But when I walked past the glass conference room, I froze. He was in there with Allison, her parents, and a man in a navy suit. Spread out on the table were maps of my land. I stood in the hallway, heart pounding. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Perfect spot for expansion. Subdivision could bring in millions. "Don't worry, Jacob. Your father won't stand in the way. He'll sign when the time comes." And then Jacob's voice, low but firm. "Honestly, I don't think Dad even understands what he owns. He's stuck in the past." My throat went dry. They weren't just ashamed of me. They were planning to cut me out entirely, use me as a pawn to get what they wanted. I walked away before anyone saw me, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry bees. That night, sitting in the dark with only the hum of the fridge behind me, I made my decision. If Jacob and the Whitmans thought I was too old, too stupid, too small town to fight back, they were in for the rudest awakening of their lives, because I wasn't going to sell them a damn thing. No, I was going to make sure the whole town saw exactly who they really were, and I knew just how to do it. I didn't waste time. The Whitmans were sharks, and sharks never sleep. I knew if I hesitated, they'd find a way to box me in legally, maybe even trick Jacob into forging my name on something. I had to move first. The next morning, I drove straight to the office of Harold Hal Donnelly, a lawyer I'd known since our high school football days. Hal had a sharp mind, a gruff way of talking, and, most importantly, a reputation for sniffing out dirty business deals like a bloodhound. I laid everything out for him. The land, the Whitmans, the overheard meeting, Jacob's words. Hal leaned back in his chair, chewing the end of his pen. "Bob, I'll be straight with you. They can't touch that land as long as the deed's in your name. But if they're already drawing up development plans, I'd bet good money they're banking on pressuring you into signing, maybe even pushing the boundaries of the law." I asked him what he meant. Fake signatures, misleading contracts, intimidation. Hell, they might even try to paint you as senile in court. I've seen it all before. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "But if you're willing to fight, we can stop them cold." I nodded. "I'm willing," Hal grinned. "Then let's make this interesting." We drew up a plan. First, Hal would file a protective notice with the county recorder, essentially putting a bright red flag on the property. Nothing could move forward without my personal notarized consent. Second, he suggested I invite the Whitmans to make their pitch in a public setting, somewhere they'd feel confident, somewhere the whole town could hear. "Bait the trap," he said. "Let them expose themselves." The opportunity came quicker than I expected. 2 weeks later, the Whitmans threw a big fundraiser dinner at the community center downtown. It was one of those small-town events where everyone turned out. Business owners, pastors, even the mayor. The Whitmans were the stars of the evening, strutting around like royalty. I walked in wearing my old brown sport coat, the one I'd had since the 80s. Heads turned. Some folks smiled politely, others just nodded. And then I saw Jacob across the room. His smile faltered when our eyes met. But Allison quickly slipped her hand into his arm, whispering something that made him straighten up. Halfway through the evening, as coffee was being poured and the smell of prime rib lingered in the air, Mr. Whitman clinked his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "tonight we don't just celebrate our community, we look to its future. And I'm proud to announce a project that will bring prosperity and growth to our town." The lights dimmed, and a projector lit up the screen behind him. My heart clenched. It was my land. Colored diagrams showed neat rows of houses, cul-de-sacs, and shopping strips. A bold title read, "Whitman Estates, coming soon." Gasps rippled through the crowd, murmurs of excitement. A few folks clapped. And then, as if I were invisible, Mr. Whitman added, "We're already finalizing agreements, and construction could begin as early as spring." I stood up. The legs of my chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every head turned. The room fell silent. "My name," I said, voice steady, "is Robert Miller, and that land you just saw on the screen belongs to me." Whispers shot through the crowd. I could see Allison stiffen, her parents exchanging sharp looks. Jacob's face turned pale. I pulled the folded deed from my jacket pocket and held it up. "Here's the county-certified record. Hasn't changed hands in over 20 years, which means every word you just heard about this project is a lie." The mayor squirmed in his chair. The pastor leaned forward. People craned their necks to get a better view. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Now, Bob, let's not be dramatic. We've had some preliminary discussions, No, you haven't, I cut him off, because nobody asked me a damn thing. Instead, you sat in back rooms and whispered in my son's ear, trying to convince him I was too old and too stupid to understand what I own. Gasps again. Jacob buried his face in his hands. Allison's nails dug into his arm. I set the deed down on the nearest table. Well, I understand just fine. And let me make something perfectly clear. I will never sell you that land. Not for $1 million, not for 10 million. Not ever. Silence. You could hear the hum of the soda machine by the door. Then, slowly, applause began. Hesitant at first, but growing. Folks who'd known me for decades, who'd worked beside me on job sites, who'd eaten at my kitchen table, they clapped. And the Whitmans? They stood frozen, faces red, humiliated in front of the very people they wanted to impress. But I wasn't finished yet, because I still had one more card to play. The fundraiser ended in chaos. The Whitmans left early, their projector cart wheeled out in embarrassed silence. Jacob and Allison slipped out a side door, avoiding my eyes. Folks came up to me, patting my shoulder, whispering, "Good for you, Bob," and about time somebody stood up to them. But I wasn't smiling. Not yet. See, humiliation in front of a crowd is one thing. Real consequences are another. And I wanted both. The next week, I met Hal again at his office. He had a stack of papers waiting. "We've got them, Bob," he said with a grin. "Turns out the Whitmans already submitted preliminary permits to the county. With your signature on them." I froze. "My signature?" Hal slid the papers across the desk. "Forged. Sloppy. But they figured the county clerk wouldn't question it. And maybe they wouldn't have, if we hadn't filed that protective notice." I studied the fake scrawl. They hadn't even tried hard. It was a poor imitation, jagged and rushed. But it was enough to show intent, enough to show fraud. Hal leaned back. "We're pressing charges. Fraud, forgery, attempted theft of property. Once this hits court, they're cooked." I nodded slowly. "And Jacob?" Hal hesitated. "His name isn't on the paperwork. But witnesses might place him in meetings. You want me to drag him in?" I sat back in my chair, staring out Hal's dusty window at the grain silos in the distance. My chest ached. He was my son, my only son. But he had chosen them over me, and sometimes choices have a price. "Yes," I finally said. "If he stood with them, he goes down with them." The case moved fast. Small towns have long memories and a short fuse for dishonesty. By the time the Whitmans appeared in court, the whole county knew the story. Reporters even came down from Des Moines, their cameras flashing as the family walked into the courthouse, looking more like defendants than developers. And Jacob, my boy, was with them. His tie was crooked, his face pale, but he walked at Allison's side, eyes fixed forward. He didn't glance once at me. Inside, Hal tore their case apart like a wolf on a carcass. He presented the deed, the protective notice, the forged documents. He called in experts who swore my signature was fake. And then he called witnesses, contractors who'd been approached by Jacob, offering them upcoming work on the project. The final blow came when Hal played a recording. Remember that afternoon at the diner, when I overheard Jacob with the Whitmans? Turns out the waitress had slipped her phone under their booth. Tired of hearing big talkers run down decent folks, she'd given the recording to Hal. The jury sat stone-faced as Jacob's voice played through the speakers. "My dad's stuck in the past. Once we get that land, I'll finally be free of him." The room went quiet. Jacob's head dropped. Allison's face twisted in fury. The judge didn't take long. The Whitmans were fined heavily, barred from development for 5 years, and charged with attempted fraud. Jacob avoided prison, but his name was splashed across every local paper. Contractor's son tied to forgery scandal. His reputation, what little he'd built, was in ruins. After court, I walked out into the cold Iowa air. Reporters shouted questions, cameras clicked, but I ignored them. Instead, I turned and saw Jacob standing alone by the courthouse steps. Allison was gone. She'd stormed off with her parents. He looked up at me, his eyes wet. "Dad, I didn't mean—" I held up a hand. My voice was steady, calm. "Son, you meant every word, and now you've got to live with it." He tried to speak again, but no words came. He just stood there, shoulders slumped, as I walked past him. That night, I sat alone on my porch. The cicadas buzzed, the smell of cut grass still in the air. My land stretched out before me, safe, untouched. And though my heart was heavy, it was also steady. The Whitmans had lost everything. Jacob had lost his pride. And me? I had won back my dignity. So if you're listening to this, take it from an old man who learned the hard way. Sometimes family will betray you. Sometimes neighbors will smile while they sharpen their knives. But if you stand firm, if you don't bend, truth has a way of standing with you. Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories.